Hello and welcome back to Fighting on Film. This week we are belatedly celebrating the United States 250th anniversary. Now, Robbie's on holiday this week, but I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Alexander Burns. Alex is a professor and author of Infantry in Battle 1733-1783. He's also the co-host of the excellent Prime and Low podcast. So who better to join us today to talk about the latest historical epic from Angel Studios, Young Washington. Alex, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So basically, I think we're going to have a bit of a chat today about Young Washington and just see how it stacks up. I was quite excited for this film. I thought this is a great way of, celebrating the 250th anniversary of the US and, shedding some light on a pivotal figure in American history. But then the trailers dropped and we all got a little bit more worried, a little bit more concerned. So I'm looking forward to unpacking that and kind of just discussing whether things were as bad as the trailers kind of hinted they may be. So just for the listener, this is going to be a bit of a spoiler review episode, obviously, because we want to delve in deep and talk about not only the history, but also the cinematic production of this. So I'll just run through cast and production very quickly. Alex, feel free to jump in, as I mentioned before we began recording. So, written and directed by John Erwin, who's a filmmaker with a background in Christian faith films, that sort of thing. And it's a production with the Angel Studios, which is a kind of video on demand, relatively new enterprise, began in 2022. And this is, I think it's fair to say, is perhaps their biggest film so far in terms of production and budget. Couldn't find an actual budget for the film. I would say it's probably maybe 10 million, something like that, perhaps. And an interesting cast. So we have William Franklin Miller as George Washington, and this is his first lead role in a film, which I thought was really interesting. And reportedly, he did weeks of research and accent work to prepare to portray Washington. How do you think he did, Alex?
There were several moments in the movie where he was absolutely the tallest man in the room. I think in some ways that was his great contribution to portraying Washington accurately. I, as far as doing weeks of research, I don't know that anything in his performance stood out to me as like, wow, he's an incredible method actor or something like this. But there were times when I thought, he's a good stand-in for Washington. The picture on screen looks like he might appear a little bit like Washington. Certainly, he has a very distinctive profile. There were several dark shots in the film where I was kind of didn't know exactly who was on screen, but you could tell it was him via his profile.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think it's fair to say he does a very serviceable job. There's nothing outstanding, but I mean that could also be a writing element, and I don't know whether it's his first role, and it's a big thing to take on a character like George Washington, who's so well known and a pivotal historical figure. It must have been quite daunting to jump into that, I suppose, but interesting nonetheless.
Certainly, he was very physically able in a lot of the action sequences. I thought that was well done. Yeah.
Then we got Ben Kingsley as Robert Dinwiddie, the governor. He's in about 2 or 3 scenes. Lots of kind of gravitas on screen, as you'd expect from Sir Ben Kingsley. I don't know much about Robert Dinwiddie in terms of how we can assess whether Kingsley really captured his essence. I don't know. Are you familiar with Dinwiddie?
Yeah, I guess I would say there are a number of characters in this film, and Kingsley's Dinwiddie is one who in real life are Scots and are portrayed as just being kind of like bog standard Englishman from London or something like this. And I found that a little bit jarring. The same, he's kind of more of a bit character in the film. The same is true of Charles McKay later on in the film. But so that surprised me. But I watch Ben Kingsley in a movie that has paint dry, so I wasn't shocked by that. Right? I mean, he added a great deal of presence to the film.
Yeah, I thought they were some of the more watchable kind of elements of the film that kind of conveyed the context and the exposition that was needed. Then we've got Joel Smallbone as George William Fairfax. Then we have Kelsey Grammer as Thomas Fairfax, who has a couple of scenes. Um,
It was a little bit jarring seeing Kelsey Grammer in this for me, just because I associate him obviously with earlier work, sometimes comedic work.
yeah,
Um, as far as there's a lot of portrayal in each of the actors that we talked about so far, in which there are large comments in this film about class and the nature of
yeah,
class
there are,
relationships
yeah.
in colonial America.
Mm.
And so I thought that of the kind of stuck-up aristocrats which littered this film, Kelsey Grammer's Fairfax was more approachable, maybe a little bit more pleasant to see on screen than some of the other stereotypes or caricatures that
Mm.
were in the film. So I thought he did a good job.
Yeah, I think historically Fairfax is an interesting character, obviously, because he was the only, you know, British lord or peer to be, you know, actually living in America
Yeah.
during the period, or you know, ever. To be fair, um, one that jarred for me the most, I think, was Andy Serkis as Braddock. Andy Serkis doesn't normally play the aristocratic kind of officer class, and it was an interesting casting for sure. There's not a great deal of screen time for him in general, which is a little bit surprising because I believe I may be mistaken, but I believe that Washington and Braddock got on fairly well.
Yeah, I think, and nothing against Andy Serkis, who have loved his performances across his career, especially in Andor. It was incredible.
Yeah, he's great in a
But
lot of roles, but this wasn't a standout. I don't think.
yeah,
I think it's
and
fair
I
to
and I
say.
don't necessarily think it was him. I think it's the shape of the writing, the direction of the character. I mean, in real life, Washington and Braddock have a good relationship. When people try to slag Braddock off later in life, Washington usually stands up and defends him and was like, it's not really his fault. A lot of people in the War Council thought the same way that he thought. He was unfortunate rather than a bad general. Like he got unlucky. Basically, Washington says all of these things, like sticking up for Braddock. Nothing
Mm.
in the film, and again, I don't think this is necessarily Andy Serkis' portrayal, led me to believe that Washington would have stuck up for Braddock when all this was said and done. Even kind of the moment where they reconcile, spoilers, I guess, on Braddock's deathbed scene. It didn't work for me. Nothing against Andy Serkis, but it didn't really work for me. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of arrogance to it, and I'm sure Braddock had an element of that. And if listeners aren't familiar with this, he was given command of this expedition to move the French out of the Ohio River Valley, and basically it led to one of the worst British military disasters of the 18th century. I thought there was a lot of leaning into the whole native way of war, American way of war, throughout those segments, but I think we'll talk about that later on. Rounding out cast, we've got Mary Louise Parker, who plays Mary Ball Washington, who is Washington's mother, who's quite hard pressed. She's very stern, but there's a few moments of gentleness between the two of them, but she's very much a stern characterization. And oddly, I think Mary Louise Parker chose an almost Irish accent for Mary Ball Washington, which was really threw me. I didn't. There was one scene where she has an extended amount of dialogue, and it just dawned on me that she's leaning into a bit of an Irish lilt here.
Yeah, I don't know if it was an effort to kind of sound old timey or what the idea
Mm,
was, but yeah, I also, and I think we said this before while we were chatting, but one of the things that kind of jarred me about this was there are times when there's language in this that very to some extent feels of the period that you might be reading the transcript of a letter from Washington and that type of language is in the film, but there's also just dialogue that it sounds like it's happening between 21st century people. And that was one of the things that I think I struggled with maybe a little bit with Mary Louise Parker's performances. At no point when she was on screen did I not think, oh, that's Mary Louise Parker.
mm.
So yeah, I again,
I think
nothing.
that's one of the issues with this film is that all of the notable cast members are all actors that you recognize, but none of them quite succeed in taking you out of it being them and putting you into it being the character,
Yeah.
so to speak. Um,
A final shout out to Clement Toyon, who plays Ensign Jumanvi. I thought he was in a film with a lot of villains, because I do think there are a surprising number of kind of opposition characters in this film, besides for, I mean, basically everyone besides for Washington and his mother and maybe Lawrence in this film is a potential antagonist for Washington. Even
Yeah.
some of his like friends and Virginian friends don't really like him very much at a lot of points in this film. He was by far the most compelling antagonist, from my perspective. Now, Ensign Jumonville was not at Fort Le Boeuf in 1753. That was a different French officer. But having a sort of composite French officer who's killed, I thought he Montoyon did a great job acting in that. It's something
Hmm.
we didn't touch on. I also do think that the Native American sections of this film were handled with a relative degree of taste. And so there was a little bit cheesy at the end, I think, where a Native American warrior like basically summons Washington out as like, you've been chosen by God to do great things, which
Yeah, yeah.
that
We
was,
all
I
we
mean,
all
that
fired on
obviously
you
that's,
and nothing hit you kind of moment, which is a
yeah.
myth around the whole like bullet hole in the tunic kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
I guess.
absolutely. I thought that was a bit much, but Tana Greason was one of the more uh developed characters in this film, which I
Mm.
was not expecting going in.
It was actually one of the more deftly handled bits of the writing, I think, that
Yeah,
managed to convey the importance of the Native Americans in the area in
absolutely.
those small scenes. So as of now, we know that the film has reached a box office take of 20 million, which is pretty impressive. And the director, Erwin, has announced a sequel, 1776, which is going to deal with Washington's experiences during the American Revolution, which is going to be extremely ambitious, I would say. I'd say there's a lot more that you're going to need to depict in that sort of film than this young Washington kind of era, let's say. I think that's going to be an AI extravaganza. I think it'll have to be because the budget just aren't there for these kind of films, sadly. And I think that's a good place to talk a bit about the AI that appears in the film. So there's a number of bits of the film where generative AI is used, and Erwin's quite forward with this. He's long-standing proponent of not being afraid of using a little bit of AI in post-production. And there are several shots in there that you can pick out very easily. The firing of the cannons at Fort Necessity is one. Making the water when they jump into I guess the Ohio River. I'm not sure. When they jump into the river, look colder than it was. So that was something I saw in the trailer, and I know you were as well from your social media posts, and I was quite worried about that when it appeared in the trailer. The cannons, especially. What did you
yeah.
think of the cannons, Alex? Do tell me.
If I'm being honest, I was horrified by the cannons. So just to for those maybe who haven't seen it, I mean, maybe I'll just go watch it if you so desire before being spoiled like this. But um, both the Fort Necessity sequences and the fighting on the Monongahela include the quasi-medieval French siege guns where you have large, I mean, seemingly 24 or 36-pound siege
Yeah,
cannon on naval carriages
we're talking
out
Mons Meg size things here. Like it's
out in the backcountry.
yeah.
I don't know how they got there. Um, there's a memorable shot, and I've talked a little bit about this on social media, but there's a memorable shot where you can tell just by like the style of the lighting that it's AI. Um, but one of the cannons has a wheel that's not in the shape of a wheel; it's in the shape of a figure eight. And so I'm not sure how you've
Even
transported this
worse.
giant siege gun to the backcountry of Ohio and Pennsylvania with a deformed wheel. It really kind of takes you out of the film.
I love the bit where they loaded it with a 2x4.
Yeah, yeah.
That was quite that threw me. Seeing the whole, as you've explained, the huge late medieval cannon, and then what is clearly a 2x4 with a rag tied to the end being
Mhm.
used to ram home powder and ball. I was like, that wouldn't be a 2x4. That wouldn't be a rectangle.
Yeah, yeah,
It's just visually very jarring, and something that
yeah, it
wasn't
is.
needed because there weren't any siege guns at any of these engagements.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah. Absolutely not. So that, I mean, I think that's a probably a directorial choice, or
Mm,
it's at some point someone other than the I would imagine the extras made the decision, man, we should have a cannon in these sequences and not there's also like a small light. I mean, it looks like a honestly a 1 pounder or 3 pounder or even maybe a miniaturized gun on the English side
mm.
of the engagement at Fort Necessity. Artillery was not a major feature of these battles. Braddock had some small guns with him, but I think there was a desire to have cannons. I mean, it's a movie about 8th century warfare, so you've got to have cannons.
One bit that I did just remember is there's a bit where one of the Virginians shouts, "This damn Brit gun doesn't work,"
Hmm.
which amused me. I was like, well, it's probably quite an old lamp pattern, so that did make me laugh.
Yeah, I guess we never really did like the alley tally, but there were a
No, not this week. No,
surprising
no.
number of like short cavalry carbines
Mm,
in this film. Um, Beside, I mean, we've talked about the cannons and maybe the lack thereof of being great. I mean, there were some. I mean, the French by and large were using Charleville muskets,
yes,
and the
yeah,
British by and large were using land pattern muskets, which I thought was nice. There were a couple scenes where very evidently there was a like an 1850s percussion cap, musket on screen, which I did not
a
love.
classic
Um,
anachronism.
but there was also a surprising amount of cavalry in this film.
Yeah, yeah,
The moment in supposedly 1753, the chronological timing is going to be something we can talk about as well later on, um, where Washington and his party approach Fort Le Boeuf. You
mm,
have a French garrison coming out to meet them, and it's like a third cavalry,
yeah, in the
which
center. Yeah,
which not to say that the French and other colonial powers did not occasionally use mounted infantry, but having a large number of uniformed cavalry soldiers is not a major feature of the colonial policy of either of these states.
mm.
So yeah, there were choices that were a little jarring. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention here that just the kind of environment they're fighting through. They're fighting through virgin forest, essentially, outside of just the local native tribes moving through. There isn't any infrastructure. There's no way to move guns. You're talking about moving along very small animal tracks or tracks that Indian traders use, that sort of thing at this point. And Braddock famously builds the road, the military road, in order to get to later on Fort Duquesne, and that is a big prominent feature of that campaign. And for the French to already be there with cannon, it's just like it just shows that there's either no understanding of the nature of the warfare in that theatre in that period, or a complete disregard just for the filmmaking aspect of it, which is it's fair enough. It is a piece of media. It's a film after all.
Yeah.
And audiences come to expect these things, as you said, with cannons and stuff like that. But I definitely wouldn't have expected a medieval siege gun. That's for sure.
Mhm.
Um, let's move on and talk a little bit about kind of the way the film approaches Washington's story, because it opens up with a cold open, doesn't it, of Monongahela,
Yeah.
and then it jumps back 12 years to the funeral of his father, and then the introduction of Washington's half brother.
Yeah. Lawrence.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I don't know. I think the film handles the characters really quite in a way that's not quite clear, because I didn't know who that character was for the first 10, 15 minutes of him being there. I thought he was an uncle or something like that. Um, and he's introduced, and then he continues to be the sounding board for Washington throughout the film, long after he'd actually died in reality,
Yeah.
which I thought was if you don't know that history, that's fine, it works completely. But if you have an understanding of like Washington's family and the background there, there's a number of occasions in this film where they have people who are long dead that are still alive, people who are unmarried that were at the time married, people who die who didn't die, and people who don't die that did die. So it's kind of like there's a lot of liberties taken for the kind of just the narrative nature of the film.
Yeah, especially when it's kind of being touted on social media as a great historical film, a great way to sort of learn about the history of the period. Yeah, I will say, I thought that John Foss did a good and likable job as Washington's older half brother
Absolutely.
Lawrence. I thought he was one
Yeah.
of the actually the most likable characters in the film. For those who don't know, Lawrence Washington is a fascinating man in his own right. He's more of like relatable older half brother in real life than he was in this film, who, as you already said, was aged to look like more of an uncle. I mean, he looked like he could have been 50 in the film,
Mm.
whereas in reality, he's only 14 years older than Washington. So in that first scene where they're talking at his father's funeral, Washington's 11, Lawrence should be 25. And that's the kind of dynamic they have. Also, they don't really, it's not like Washington had no idea who Lawrence was before this. He kind of followed Lawrence's career, and again, some light liberties, which is I mention Lawrence Washington every semester when I lecture in the first half of U.S. history, because I think he is a big formative impact on Washington. But he's not a captain in the Royal Navy. He's a member.
That was
He's like a
very
Marine
weird.
officer.
Yeah.
So I guess in that way he might kind of be under the jurisdiction of the Navy, but I mean he's in the Gooch's American Regiment during the War of Jenkins' Ear or the War of Austrian Succession, depending on how you want to frame it. Um, Fascinating man in his own right. We just did a episode on Prime and Load, the podcast, historical podcast that I host about the Battle of Cartagena in the War of Jenkins' Ear, where Lawrence Washington, and the American forces were there. Um, yeah, so I liked how he was handled in the film in terms of, yes, he needs to be there. If you're going to make a movie about young George Washington, Lawrence has got to be. In some ways, I thought he was almost like the Obi-Wan Kenobi figure of this movie, right? I mean, he's the guy who's sort of like the older mentor to Washington, but there were some decisions that were made there that jarred me a little bit, I guess.
I agree. The actor John Foster really well with the character, and it was one of the more enjoyable aspects. But I will happily admit that as I was watching the film, I was like, this is I need to check this. So I was like, was he in the Royal Navy? So I was like on Wikipedia looking that up because I'm familiar with the period. I'm not an expert, obviously, but I did study Braddock and infantry tactics in the period when I did my undergraduate degree because it was an area of real interest for me, how light infantry developed. And I'm looking forward to talking about that in a moment, of how the film handles the nature of the warfare of that period. And how that fits in with other films. But yeah, I was quite interested in the progression of the film. I thought once they got into the chronology of the events, they kind of stuck to it. There was a little bit of moving around, and there's a bit of a love interest where they have Sarah Carey as unmarried at the time, whereas she'd been married since like 1849, 48, I believe. And that kind of almost whitewashes Washington's interest in her a little bit, I thought, which is, do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, and without maybe getting too political, because I don't really think there's a place for that here. The film, I think, whitewashes a number of complexities
Hmm.
to try and portray Washington in a positive light. I mean, as someone who's a citizen of the United States, I don't always hate that, but I think it's worth knowing that we go into that with kind of eyes open, that
Yeah.
is kind of happening throughout the film. I mean, there are a number of kind of morally ambiguous things that are done in the film that the film says, no, we don't know what happened. And if you actually look at the record, it's maybe it's not as obscure as maybe the film would like it to be.
Hmm. Yeah, I would. Interestingly enough, around the commentary of the film, I did see someone mention on social media that it kind of represents like a high school or grade school understanding of Washington. You know, that's the kind of narrative that they've taken for it to be, you know, accessible and understandable and make good cinema, basically. And I think it's an approach that many filmmakers have taken in the past. Humans are complex beings, and film doesn't always want or have the time to kind of delve into those. Sometimes more the pity. I think, you know, delving into that makes really great cinema. But I don't think that was the aim of this film. I think this film wanted to kind of celebrate the man. And to be fair to it, there were a number of occasions where it showed him as fallible. You know, there's the scenes in Fort Necessity where they're all going, "You've put the fort in the worst place possible," and he's adamant that it's fine. We're going to stay here, which I think is a relatively authentic representation of that, because he was an inexperienced officer. There were elements of his command decision, I should say, decisions that were, you know, obviously naive at occasions. And he learned a lot during the war. It was one of the most formative, you know, elements of his life for his later military career, I'm sure. I also think as it progresses through those elements, I thought it handled a couple of the elements quite well. That the Battle of Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity were two of the better set pieces, I thought, that kind of represented that really well. And I thought that those two benefited from a smaller scale, especially the Jumonville Glen engagement, where it literally just looks like a couple of dozen men on a hillside looking down on a couple of dozen Frenchmen, which I think is a relatively true to history. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I did enjoy that sequence a lot. I mean, you can't make make a Jumonville Glen sequence without Tennant Greason uttering the words, you know, "You're not yet dead, my French father," and that, you know, that does appear in the film, which I was gratified to see. That was also I wrote about this on Twitter last night. That's also the first time in that sequence we see Washington like wheel around and blow somebody away with a pistol. I think that happens like 4 times throughout the movie. So there is certainly great deal of action, even in this relatively small sequence. One of the things that I was, because the film was so adamant about it, one of the things that I stuck in my craw a little bit, or at least if I had been John Irwin, I don't know that I would have made it the same way. And obviously, I'm not John Irwin. I'm a history professor, so you know, obviously, you know, we're going to make things different ways. The film emphatically says, I think, twice on screen in the voices of different actors, we don't know who fired the first shot at Jumonville Glen, excuse me. And if you read most primary sources describing that engagement, it's fairly clear that the Englishmen fire first. The Virginians, or the troops under Washington's command, fire first. That they come upon the French somewhat unexpectedly. They're kind of surrounding the French. Up to that point, I think it's fairly well done in the movie. And then it's almost like the shot heard around the world in the Revolutionary War in the movie. Like you hear a gunshot go off, and everyone's like, "Whoa, who shot?" If you read accounts from Washington, from the French, from other people who were there, the sequence of events, I think, is pretty clear. The English, their native allies, Tennant Greason, etc., they're coming up on Ensign Jumonville and the forces encamped there, and the French are initially unaware. They detect the English. They're panicked. They start to sort of react to the fact that you potentially a hostile forces in the neighborhood. And at that moment, Washington or another, maybe more junior officer orders the English troops to fire. And so there are a few accounts that present things differently, but I would say in the grand scheme of things, it's not quite like the film portrays. You know, the shot heard around the world. We don't know who fired the first shot. We don't know what happens. Most accounts are fairly clear that the English begin this engagement, maybe because it looks like the French are about to fire on them, right? But I think there are a couple moments after this sequence in the film where Washington is talking with other subordinates, and they say, "Man, we don't know who fired that first shot." That's something that took me out a little bit, just because, again, as a history professor, this is something that I've lectured on. that took me out a little bit because it's kind of contradicting the primary sources in some ways.
Mm. What did you think of the portrayal of Washington kind of, you know, being restrained or almost dithering about whether they should engage? I think Gist is like, we should, open fire, that kind of thing. And he's very reluctant to do so. What did you think about that?
So I think in a lot of ways, William Franklin Miller's portrayal of Washington in this film did speak to me of real life in terms of like he's a 22-year-old kid who's kind of excited to be like in combat for the first
Mm,
time. Um, that was not that moment of him kind of being like, restrained. It doesn't really match up even with what Washington writes right after the battle. He writes a letter home saying, "I heard the bullets whistle, and there was something pleasing in the sound." Which
mm,
is like, he's gung ho. He almost like he's enjoying it. Um, which I'm not sure from maybe from hindsight, the viewer knows that this is the start of a world war that lasts 7 years. Maybe it doesn't portray Washington in like from the 21st century moral values, a positive light. If he's really excited to sort of be in this first engagement of a giant world war that, I mean, I think you could say, and certainly the French would say, that he kind of starts. But this is kind of how the film chooses to portray it. I think to some extent what happens is we know that Washington is horrified by Tanner Greason's murder for all intents and purposes of Ensign Jumonville. And so as a result of that kind of squeamishness about a Native American warrior executing a prisoner after the fighting is done, I think that's been transferred to the engagement as a whole, to make Washington look like he's maybe more hesitant here than he actually was in real life. I think Washington in real life was very excited. Certainly his adrenaline was pumping, while the battle was going on, but certainly in the aftermath was disturbed that this prisoner of war, this officer, by the standards of European warfare, obviously you're supposed to protect the lives of prisoners of war and certainly captured officers. This is something that is he is actually horrified by, and I think the film
yeah,
gets that part
absolutely.
of it right.
Mm. But that's one of the interesting sort of characterization decisions that is made by the film. It's interesting to hear you say that it's probably contrary to the reality, and that I was quite surprised that it portrayed him, as in that manner, because it isn't the classic archetypal, gung ho, all American kind of, visualization of a film like this could easily go into a very kind of stereotypical, almost cartoonish, caricaturish representation of, a character like that. And I thought that was one of the moments where the film tried to give Washington's character a little bit more depth. But it's interesting to hear that that's probably one of the occasions where he didn't have that kind of doubt and you know
Yeah, I think like a lot of young men at the time, he was inspired by the example of Charles the XII of Sweden. Voltaire writes his famous biography of this Swedish king earlier in the century, and we know from like the marble busts that he has at Mount Vernon that Charles the XII is one of his heroes, and Charles the XII makes almost that exact same comment the first time that he is in action. He hears the bullets whistle and he asks his soldiers who are like rowing the boats, almost like in a 18th century D-Day situation. What's that noise? And um, they reply, "Well, they're shooting at us, Your Majesty." And Charles the XII comes back with, "Ah, henceforth this shall be my music." So I think in some ways Washington is riffing off of that in his comment to his I think his brother at home, in this letter where he says, "I heard the bullets whistle and there was something pleasing in the sound." It's part of almost being like, what it is to be an 18th century masculine man, in military service. Um, yeah, there were a couple moments where maybe more depth was added, or more circumspection was added to Washington that I think he portrayed historically. The second was, and maybe we're running on a little bit in the kind of the sequence of the film, but after Fort Necessity, he returns to Dinwiddie and failure, and William Franklin Miller portrays him as so almost like pensive, like, I went out there, I messed up, I got people killed, I got my friend Christopher Gist killed. Well, don't worry, Washington, it's going to be okay. Christopher Gist didn't actually get killed there. It's not on you, buddy. Um, in real life, Washington does resign after the Fort Necessity debacle. but it's because his honor is slighted. It's because the Virginia Regiment is reorganized and additional companies are created. And as opposed to being Major Washington, he would have to become the commander of a company, being demoted to Captain Washington. And so he resigns here, not because he's been humiliated or has gone through almost like this crisis of faith where he's not able to go out and be the hero he wants to be. He resigns here because he feels like his reputation, his honor have been slighted by what is perceived as a demotion. And
It was a
this is
career
not me
decision.
criticizing
Yeah.
Washington. If I
Mm.
was demoted at work, I would probably be pretty miffed too. But that was a moment where I think the film did try to portray him with depth, but depth that wasn't necessarily historical.
Hello, I'm Al Murray, and you're listening to Fighting on Film, the world's #1 war film podcast.
Hello there. Sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that you can now join our supporting cast over on Patreon. As thanks for your support, you'll be able to help us pick films, submit questions for guests, have first pick on brand new and exclusive merch, and much more. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show. I think now is a good time to kind of perhaps dig into the depictions of the actual combat in the film. And the reason I like the Jumonville Glen segment was because it's probably the closest to the nature of that period of warfare where they are using cover, they are using the ground. The numbers aren't inflated. I think there's probably like 30 to 40 people on both sides of that battle. These conflicts are in North America at the time are really small. People don't really appreciate that the battles of the period were very small. If you got more than 1,500 men on a field, that was quite something. Whereas in Europe, you're looking at, as you well know, like tens of thousands of men at this point in the early modern period.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think you're absolutely right. In some ways, the Jumonville's Glen sequence is the most believable because you don't require like AI CGI in order to kind of buff out the numbers and make it look more believable. You can just do it with the extras that you have on hand. And I did think that of all the combat sequences in the film, I thought that one was probably the best done.
What did warfare at this point look like? I mean, for most people listening, they probably they don't really have an understanding outside of linear battle, that kind of thing, and it's very different in North America, isn't it?
Yeah, and not just in North America. So get the hook when I've gone on too long. I mean, obviously, this is what I actually write about in my scholarly research. So feel free to cut me off when needs be. But 18th century warfare. I mean, we've already kind of talked about it a little bit, right? I mean, 18th century Englishmen would think about land warfare in three branches of service: horse, foot, and guns. That is to say, cavalry, infantry, and artillery, and then probably in that order of prestige, right? And in Europe, and to some extent, sometimes in America, what you do is the infantrymen will exchange fire. The artillery usually will target battalions of infantry. Occasionally, officers will order you to do counter battery fire. That's viewed as almost being like a sign that you're a fairly good gunner if you can accomplish some counter battery fire. There's not a lot of cavalry in North America. Certainly not as much as maybe the film depicts it at Fort Le Boeuf. But I would say it's not absent either. So it's kind of a complex relationship there. In Europe, generally the infantry fight in the center, the cavalry are deployed on either wings fighting, the artillery is kind of interspersed throughout. One of the things that I've tried to really dial into in my academic research is what it was like for infantrymen to fight in these battles. And this made the film, I think, particularly hard to watch for me. Well, hopefully other people won't be sort of cursed with this knowledge, but the distinction between the fighting in North America and the fighting in Europe is really overdrawn in the film. When a French commander who we did not get to, maybe mercifully in this film, the Marquis de Montcalm, comes over and leads French forces in some of the more successful, almost middle years of this war, at fighting like the fighting at Carillon and Fort William Henry, or Ticonderoga and Fort William Henry, describing the large battle in 1758 where a large English force and colonial Americans attacks Fort Ticonderoga, or at that point, Carry-On. Both sides are taking cover behind trees. Both sides are taking cover behind small, earthworks that have been created. And writing a letter home from that battle, Marquis de Montcalm, the French commander, doesn't say, "Wow, this is nuts. The guys all hide behind trees. I've never seen anything like this before." He says the firefight on both sides was like that at the Battle of Parma, which was a fight that had occurred in the 1730s in Europe, in Italy, in northern Italy. And so especially the scene where Washington and Braddock meet for the first time, and Washington's like, "You don't get it, bro. We have trees here in America. You don't have trees over in Europe. The soldiers just stand in lines and get shot." That's not really a very accurate. I mean, Washington might have said something like that. Certainly, the disaster on the Monongahela was a disaster where the British were trying to fight a little too formally, and the French and Native Americans sort of were ambushing them, ambushing a column in some ways. But 18th century soldiers in Europe absolutely took cover. They laid down when they were under heavy enemy fire. Sometimes, especially English soldiers in the War of Austrian Succession, especially Scottish soldiers, when the French would level their pieces or take aim and prepare to discharge a volley, Scottish regiments would throw themselves to the ground to allow the volley to pass over their heads and then stand up and fire. And so this idea of the European soldiers don't know how to fight in North America because there are trees here is not terribly helpful. Certainly, it's not helpful by the time you get to the American War of Independence, which is kind of like our national myth making on this subject, right? The American rifleman hides behind trees and kind of picks off the red coat with his bright red, regimental and his powdered wig. Whereas in reality, I mean, you have French authors who are traveling over the same ground as Washington's army, kind of, because obviously the French are allied to us. And that later war, they write, yeah, there's really nothing in America that is more rugged in terms of the terrain than what we see in like Hesse in Germany. It's that same type of like wooded, terrain environment. That's not true for Braddock out on the frontier in the French and Indian War. This idea that warfare is so different in Europe and in America, and like the soldiers in Europe just stand in straight lines and the soldiers in America all hide behind trees, that's not something that's terribly accurate, terribly helpful. The British military does absolutely become a little bit more flexible in the course of the French and Indian War. They do absolutely adopt a wilderness fighting style, something that will serve them very well in the American War of Independence. They're very tactically effective in the War of American Independence because of what they learn in the French and Indian War. And so I think in trying to show this moment where the British are kind of learning how to fight, the film really doubles down, and there's a lot of kind of heavyweight language.
Leans heavily into it, doesn't it? There's a quote from the chief that says, "You call this land the New World, but you fight like it's the old," which felt like a trailer line. To be honest, I felt like that was a very obviously they all lean into it quite hard in the conversations between Washington and Braddock. Then there's also the conversations between the Virginia militia and Washington and the other regular redcoats, where they're emphasizing get behind the trees, use cover, that kind of thing. Actually, thinking about it, there's one instance in the film where there does appear to be some skirmishes ahead of the column, and that surprised me. I didn't think we'd even get that. But there's a moment where Braddock, at the beginning of the actual battle, calls to form square.
The Gage does as well.
Yeah. Which I don't think that would have been Braddock's approach at all at that point in the battle, even if that was remotely historically accurate. What do you think of the characterization of the battle, the actual climactic battle?
Yeah, I think to some extent, I think the thesis of this film is that about marker like 105 in a conversation between Washington and Tanagreeson, which is the French are cowards and the English are fools. I think that's the message of the film in some ways. And the fighting at Monongahela, which historically the English do lose. I mean, there's no question about this, right? I mean, the French
Absolutely.
are fighting in a much more kind of native style of war. In fact, the French commander there like dresses up like a native warrior and kind of fights alongside the native warriors at that battle, right? I mean, this is a diplomacy kind of combined with tactics in some ways. The fighting at the Monongahela, as depicted in the film, I guess maybe I just telling the spoilers again, telling the viewers what happened. There's almost three different engagements. You have an advanced force out with Thomas Gage, who's in the film pretty heavily. I was not expecting him to be the major character that he was in this film. He leads out almost like the advance guard, which is ambushed by the French. Simultaneously, the main body under Braddock comes under attack, and then a group of Virginians flees, or not flees, but I guess, tactically withdraws from the main, the advance body under Gage to go take cover in a stand of woods by the river. And so you kind of have these three different engagements unfolding where Washington, who's fairly sick at this point, is back with, initially at least, with the main body under Braddock. You have Gage kind of fighting in ostensibly like an Irish field, kind of out, in the open. And then you have the Virginians who are sort of taking cover by the stand of trees down by the river. And so how we see with this setting, which is not terribly historically accurate, or how we see the battle unfold is Washington gets out of like the medical wagon that he's stashed in
with the cleanest case of dysentery you've ever seen. Yeah,
100%. Immediately picks up a pistol and blows away another guy.
Yeah, a rider.
I was not prepared
French
for the amount of pistols that Washington would be using in this film. That was
to
something.
be fair to the film, I did like the bit where he was literally holding a little cartridge to reload the pistol. I thought, oh well, look, a little bit of practical, historically accurate. He didn't load it though. He just
absolutely.
Held
it, so. He had a cartridge, I also was very impressed by that. He gets on a horse. He rides out to meet Gage. Gage is portrayed as being one of the most cowardly officers, I think, in the entire history of British film cinema, who is like, no, don't go rescue your men. They're cut off. Like you just don't do it, man. Like you're going to die. Portrayed as an absolute coward, which I didn't love that. Braddock, who again is portrayed almost as like a junior company level officer throughout this whole sequence. Yeah. He's kind of has his pistol there and is giving orders to like between 6 and 10 guys, depending on the shot.
Yeah. He calls section commands, which a general would not have been doing, obviously. But that kind of hints at the whole micromanaging linear battle kind of thing they're trying to lean into, perhaps.
Yeah. There was a command to fix bayonets about 2/3 of the way from Braddock, again to his section of like 10 guys, which was I was pleased by, because I was shocked by the complete lack of bayonets for most of this film. I assume because of insurance purposes, but again, I'm not exactly sure. I would say, and I can't recall if I've said this in the podcast yet. So if I have once already, please feel free to come down and post.
Listeners are used to us repeating ourselves.
But I did sort of feel like this was a depiction of 18th century warfare from a director who didn't really get how 18th century warfare works and was just kind of having the officers issue generic orders followed by things happening on screen, which may or usually may not correspond to what those orders actually meant. And so I think the thing that was most indicative, and I'm really getting into the weeds here, but in 18th century warfare, the command to prepare to fire is make ready and then present. Then the men then will all level their muskets or take aim, and then fire. And at one point in the Battle of Fort Necessity, Washington gives the command, take aim or present, make ready fires is happening out of sequence. There's another, maybe listeners, hopefully British listeners have seen the film Zulu that came out in the 60s. It's, it's one of the I think foundational pieces of military cinema, at least it was when I was growing up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in that film, there's an absolutely incredible sequence, which I don't know if it's accurate to the 1870s, so please, 1870 scholars, don't jump down my throat, where they depict like firing and advancing by ranks, where like one rank will fire and the second rank will step through and fire. And there's almost an effort, I think, to do that in the film. And Washington gives the command second rank advance. And I was expecting to see the guys in the second row of the battle line step forward and fire. But what happened was, as soon as he said second rank advance, a weird column, like 5 wide and maybe, 5 deep, moved out from the main formation, which is not it's not the second rank. And certainly I don't know what the director was trying to indicate there. There's just a lot of, this is the type of 18th century warfare depiction that I would expect from a 21st century director who has almost no idea, what 18th century warfare looks like, and basically saying to the extras or the director of photography, make some action happen that maybe sounds a little bit like the 18th century.
No, I think you're on the money there. There's a number of sections in the battle where he's moving through the battlefield. There's a bit where he's on a horse, and I actually laughed out loud. There's a bit where he kind of like slips out of his saddle, holds himself on the side to dodge French bullets as a fire comes from a stand of trees to the flank. And that was the most rodeo 1920s Western looking thing. It's a great stunt, and it's always cool to see it in a Western where it's more at home. But George Washington kind of pulling off that maneuver was just a little bit too much for me.
Yeah, I've seen folks on social media describe that as like the Comanche moment in the film, where you're seeing fighting styles that I think were pioneered by the Plains Indians and maybe adopted by American settlers in the West. I was speechless. There's also another where I laughed out loud during the combat sequence was the French are loading one of their like absolutely enormous siege guns, and they take a shot at Washington, and you can actually see the comically large round from one of these siege guns almost slowly going through the air.
Yeah.
And Washington kind of dodges it.
Like a projectile cam almost, like following it. I was like, man, that's a very strange cinematic choice.
Yeah. In many ways, when we're not directly talking about the battle sequences, I think the film impressed me from what my expectations were going in. This may be one of the, to real life, one of the worst depictions of 18th century warfare that I've seen in a film that's released in theaters. Again, that's not
that was my next question. Film, how does it stack up to other depictions of the warfare of this period? Yeah,
and I've caught flack on the last couple of days for some things that I've said on the about the film on social media, so I'll try to be careful here. But I would say not maybe the battle scene that everyone thinks of in Barry Lyndon, but the scenes where he's actually in the Prussian army, kind of fighting in a village. Those are some of the best 18th century warfare sequences that I've ever seen put to film. And of course, that's Stanley Kubrick, so maybe we shouldn't be shocked by that.
They've been in the farmhouse. Yeah, it's great.
And I really need to be careful what I say here, because I'm not trying to have my British academic friends like throw tomatoes at me, but there are scenes where during this movie I was almost longing for the Patriot, like even that level of reality in 18th century warfare would have been nice to see. Obviously the Patriot is not a terribly accurate film, and maybe there are some through lines in this film in terms of how much this film seems to hate the British Empire in comparison with the Patriot. But this is more like on the level of late seasons of Outlander, which some of the the Jacobite sections in Outlander in the early seasons are not horrible. The depiction of Culloden in flashbacks is not the worst depiction of Culloden I've ever seen. But like the late Outlander fighting where they're in the American War of Independence or in like the Battle of Alamet, something like this is semi-comical, and this film reminded me a lot of that.
I think that's fair to say. There was a number of elements to it that kind of jumped out to me as well in the uniform and not just the evolution of drill and stuff like that, but the uniforms were the end where Washington addresses the Virginia regiment and he's wearing like continental white and blues, and that's a complete kind of departure from the indigo and red kind of scarlet facings that are in that famous portrait of Washington that is quite well known. And that's the Virginia regiment's, quite visually distinct uniform. And I thought the film did a bit of a disservice there because it goes, oh, well, they make a point of going, I want my men to be in this color scheme, etc. And then he turns up in a completely different uniform. I thought that was really odd.
Yeah. I will say, provincial troops who are not part of the regular British establishment in the 18th century as a whole wear blues. There are volunteer regiments fighting during the Jacobite emergency in 1745 and 46 who are wearing identical clothing to what Washington's guys are wearing in the French and Indian War. It's the uniform of a lot of British provincial troops. One of the things that the film got right, and I give them credit for this. I think it's one of the best material culture decisions this film makes, is that in the early part of the war in like 1754, maybe the early months of 1755, Washington's kind of Virginia regiment is wearing red-faced red. And then from there they transition to blue-faced red. That's not necessarily because like indigo dye is available in America and not available in Europe. And this may shock listeners, but a lot of other European armies also wore blue, famously the Prussian army, which is one of the paradigm armies of the century. But that was a moment where I don't know if it was the historical advisor who was kind of jumping in saying, hey, there should be a transition from Washington's guys wearing red coats to Washington's guys wearing blue coats. Or what was done, but I thought that was quite well done. That surprised me, and it's one of the parts of the film I really enjoy.
Again, as we said, there's a whole load of discourse on class throughout the film. Lawrence kind of tries to put him in his place when he talks about wanting to be an officer of the crown, that kind of thing. The film's trying to make some interesting points. It's trying to dig into elements of class. There's a couple of elements of kind of like Fairfax's has, I think some of his slaves are present in one of the scenes. That one of the guys is running around with a powder keg at the end of the film. There's a couple of attempts to try and touch on that, but it doesn't really go into it in any great depth, I don't think.
Yeah, so there's a lot that you just said to kind of unpack, and I want to kind of try to address each in detail. First of all, again, I'm an American. I am deeply grateful for the universe and class structure that the founding fathers created for us. And to not have a nobility, I think that was a helpful thing in the long arc of American history. But this film has a comically American view of class structure in the 18th century. This is not to say that the 18th century was some sort of egalitarian place. It was not. But the idea that like no Americans were allowed to serve in the British military is laughable.
They kind of labor that point a bit, don't they?
There were dozens of American-born commissioned officers in the British Army in the 18th century. It's not something that's shocking. It's not something that it only occurs because of like loyalists in the War of Independence. Even before the War of Independence, there were maybe as many as 100 men who are not just soldiers, but commissioned officers in the British military in the 18th century. And so, actually, if I can be permitted to digress in time,
of course,
back to the 90s, there's one of the parts of the Sharp series that I really enjoy. Is there like a Virginian?
Captain
Yeah,
Leroy, yeah,
yeah, indeed,
yeah.
indeed. So in fact, I think this film could have been greatly improved by someone with a big cigar and a Virginia accent saying, "All right, boys, let's load up and do some shooting." I mean, that's one of my favorite sequences in all of Sharp, and it didn't take itself very seriously, and maybe there was a virtue in that. So the class thing was crazy from my perspective. Washington did not grow up poor. Indeed, his mother, Mary Louise Parker, in this film, reminds us that Washington at this their family owns 10 enslaved people, which is, you maybe not among the great Virginia planters who have hundreds of enslaved people, captive on these plantations, but certainly a sign that they're not doing horribly. In many ways, I think you might say Washington is born into a fairly well-off middle-class American family and kind of works his way into the greatest American families, to some extent because his half-brother Lawrence marries a Fairfax. That marriage does not produce children. Both Lawrence and his wife die, and Washington inherits Mount Vernon as a result. Um, but I actually kind of enjoyed this film's depiction of African slavery in a couple of points.
Okay.
One, I enjoyed it in comparison to The Patriot, which is maybe the most comically bad depiction of slavery ever in an 18th century war film. The sequence where I think it's Tabington, Jason Isaacs' character, comes on to Mel Gibson's plantation and says, "Hey, we're going to liberate you to serve in the British Army." And the enslaved people reply, "No, we're all free men." Well, that was be the one plantation in all of colonial America in the South where that was the case, if that was true. In comparison, this film actually does depict some ideas from relatively recent scholarship on enslaved people in the colonial South and colonial Virginia. Stephanie McCurry has written about the presence of a rival geography that enslaved people almost kind of like they know paths through marshes. They know, sort of where to get places. You might want to ask them for advice and how to get from point A to point B. This comes through really strongly in the film Free State of Jones, which American Civil War film that came out maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, Matthew McConaughey. Yeah.
Yeah, Matthew McConaughey, exactly right. And so here, when he's unable to get into the party, Washington goes and asks the enslaved
Oh,
people for
yeah.
advice.
Yeah, into the cellar
And
with the
so
ice.
in a real kind of offhand way, whether the director intended to or not, I thought this was a pretty good depiction of that rival geography where enslaved people say, "Yeah, we know the back door, the servants' entrance of the house. We can get you in." I thought again, whether it was intended or not, that was relatively well done, and certainly I think the film was more serious than The Patriot, and it did not try to depict colonial American society as some sort of like post-slavery place. There were enslaved people forced to serve in the military for the Fairfaxes against their will. Something that that it happened in real life all over colonial America. Something that's depicted in the film. So again, I'm not saying that you would want to go in this and watch this film just to get a realistic depiction of slavery in the Atlantic world. Certainly not. But as 18th century war films go, it wasn't the worst depiction of slavery that I've ever seen.
Interesting. Almost potentially accidental good history. I love it. I mean, if we discuss this as a film just for a moment, I didn't hate it as much as I thought I would. I actually, there were scenes I thought that was, pretty good. There was some good acting. There's some good characterization. Whether it's ahistorical is another debate, obviously, but there were elements where I thought it was fairly serviceable. I thought the depiction of the the battle at the end was a little bit disappointing because these kind of events are so rarely depicted on screen in this kind of scale. We've got a handful of French and Indian War films. We've got Last of the Mohicans, we've got Northwest Passage with Spencer Tracy. We've got, there's a literal handful of films that cover this period. And I was pleased, as we've already discussed, to see some of the smaller engagements covered in a relatively authentic looking way. But then later on, it didn't feel claustrophobic. It didn't feel like there was a closeness. The chaos was there, but it didn't feel like it was, life threatening at any point. I didn't feel like the men that Braddock was giving commands to were ever really in a great deal of danger until they were killed, kind of thing. I think that was a bit of a failing of the film. I quite liked the actor that portrayed Washington. I think he did a pretty good job with what he had to work with, and that's a difficult role to step into for a first lead. For an actor that isn't actually American as well. That's another big thing to kind of like step into.
Yeah, I think I said this once already, but I was surprised how much I liked it. To some extent, I think that's because, and certainly I think he's still kind of finding his feet and discovering who he is as an actor. But I thought William Franklin Miller did a good job as Washington. My problems with this film were mostly on the level of like the direction and setting and maybe tone at times. I mean, in some ways, my problems in this film are encapsulated in like one character, and that's the character of James McKay, who is the Scottish-born commander of the independent company of South Carolina, who comes to reinforce George Washington at Fort Necessity.
Who's portrayed as a regular and then is killed. Like
yes.
10 years before he was actually, 20 years before he was killed, I guess.
Yeah, like 30. He dies in 1785 on his way to visit his good friend, George Washington.
Yeah.
So the film, he comes over from Scotland at age 14. I think maybe you would have debates today in your own mind. If you're a Scottish person living in America, you coming over at age 14, am I Scottish? Am I American? It's one of these identities that's kind of hard to place. He's portrayed as being how can I say this without using bad language? He's got a stick up somewhere that the most received pronunciation.
You can use the phrase you were going to use. That's okay.
He's an absolutely ramrod straight, received pronunciation, high class British officer who could have stepped out of like a stock villain cabinet somewhere. When in reality, he and George Washington were close. He gets shot in the head at the Battle of Fort Necessity. He lives all the way until 1785 and has a relatively warm and close relationship with Washington. And so I've seen a lot of folks on Twitter, on other social media platforms saying this film's a great way to learn about history. This film is a great historical depiction of like the challenges that Washington faced. And it's not like a Marvel film, right? It's not like the French are aliens or something like this. And so it's set in the real world, I guess, to some extent. But there are also a number of ahistorical decisions in this film that I found absolutely jarring. And I think McKay's role, I mean, someone who not only like did not have a hugely antagonistic relationship with Washington at the time, but became good enough friends with him that he maintained a correspondence with him and a friendship with him later in life, 30 years on after the events at Fort Necessity, to have him be neither a Scot nor an American, but an Englishman, an aristocrat Englishman who hated Washington. And just, again, the level of the writing here, stuff like, you have no authority, George Washington. I mean, like, it was at the very least, it was very heavy-handed.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you don't know any of that stuff, like, again, I'm a history professor, so having me talk about the film is not very fair, probably, right? If you're just a run-of-the-mill person living in Britain, person living in America, you go and see this film, it's a film that's set in the French and Indian War. It's a film that, I mean, I love looking at the Irish countryside. Like, it's a very beautiful film in some ways, right?
Yes. I mean, it's worth pointing out the film was filmed in the Republic of Ireland, and a lot of the cast is obviously not American, which is interesting, I think, in point of fact. And to jump off what you were saying there, I think there are a number of ahistorical choices that are made by the film which didn't need to be made. And that kind of, that struck me. What also was kind of underlined by some of the things I saw on social media was people thinking that the film was a depiction of the American Revolutionary War. And that struck me as, quite a dangerous thing. Like, A, did you watch the film? Because they're described as French all the time. Washington is talking to British people all the time. But you can't say the film's good and then in the same breath say it's a great depiction of the Revolutionary War era. Like, that's another 20 years on. It's a completely different conflict. And we say it on this show all the time. Films are a great way of getting people to engage with history. But if you go no further than the film, then your entire understanding of a period can be shaped and based on what is depicted in that film. While I'm sat on my phone, just double checking whether Lawrence Washington was a Royal Navy captain or not, people might not do that. People might just go, oh, well, that was, his half brother was a Royal Navy captain and Thomas McKay was a out and out Brit. And, that's how it is. And Thomas Gist was killed 5 years earlier than he should have been for necessity, that kind of thing, where they might not seem like the most important details as you're sat in the cinemas watching, but they are kind of like the historical touch notes that you add them up and it breaks down the actual real understanding of that history.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think if you are looking for a fun, wholesome, lower grade B movie to go take your family to, I'd say go watch it. I had a absolutely visceral, horrible reaction to Ridley Scott's Napoleon. I didn't have that same reaction to this film.
The Washington character is much more likable than the Napoleon character. That's for sure.
Yeah. As an enjoyable movie to come out on the 4th of July, because I think that's literally was the marketing scheme, right? It's a fine B movie. It is a way to learn about history. I don't think this will rise to the level of The Patriot in terms of popularity as being a cultural touchstone. So I don't think I'll probably have to address this in class or in my future books or something like this. I like seeing Andy Serkis on screen. I like seeing Kelsey Grammer on screen. I like seeing Ben Kingsley on screen. And so all of those things were a positive for me as well. There was a surprising amount of star power for a film like this, I guess. And I found that very impressive.
Yeah, I agree. And I think describing it as an archetypal B movie is a great way of kind of describing it.
Yeah. I think my main takeaway from this is came in with extremely low expectations, and I might watch clips of this again someday. This was not not even maybe the worst film about George Washington that I've ever seen.
High praise. So there we go. I really enjoyed talking to you, Alex, about the kind of the nitty gritty of this period and the individuals the film is trying to portray. I didn't want this review to be a Brit talking about an American film that's discussing an American iconic figure. So it was great to have you on to kind of balance that out and offer an American perspective. And just kind of dig into what is actually trying to be portrayed by young Washington. So I really do appreciate you coming on. Where can people find you?
I'm terminally online at Krieg blog. It's my Twitter. You can also just Google Cabinets Krieg. That's the blog that I run. You can find my various social media email there if you want to sort of email me about any topic related to 18th century warfare. And then also myself, Dr. Andrew Bamford over in close to Litchfield. We host a historical podcast called Prime and Load. You can listen there if you're so inclined.
Highly recommended. And of course, you've got a number of publications as well, including Infantry and Battle, which I really enjoyed. And I believe you've got one coming up as well.
Indeed. Yeah. Looking at Washington and the Continental Army. Yeah.
As I said at the beginning of the show, who better to have on to chat about this period? Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of Fighting on Film. Don't forget to check out our social media. I will link out to Alex's socials and his blog and the Prime and Low podcast over on our social media accounts and on the website fightingonfilm.com. If you enjoyed the show, please do leave us a review on whatever platform you're listening, And if you'd like to, you can check out our Patreon as well. Details on that are on our website and in the show notes. Thank you, Alex. Great to chat to you. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Bye for now.
Thanks so much for having me on.